Longtime friend of the CFFC, Senator Carlos Guillermo Smith has been a bold advocate for secular values and keeping religion out of government. He made history in 2016 as Florida's first openly LGBTQ Latinx state lawmaker, elected just months after the Pulse nightclub tragedy. Since then, he's been reelected, moved into the Florida Senate. Carlos lives in Orlando with his husband, Jarek, an educator from Puerto Rico. Over the years, he's secured millions in funding for veterans, first responders, and Pulse survivors, and helped boost the arts and culture support across the state. He's also championed civil rights, mental health, cannabis reform, and workers' rights. From being named Florida PTA's Legislator of the Year to being honored as Orlando's 50 most powerful people, Carlos continues to lead with passion and purpose. And we are honored to have him with us again. So please give a warm welcome.
Hi. What an intro. Hey, everybody. How are you doing? Thank you, Jocelyn, for that wonderful introduction. I'm Carlos Guillermo Smith. I am your state senator representing State Senate District 17 in Central Florida. And yes, I have been a longtime supporter of the Central Florida Freethought community. Thank you all for what you do. And I would like to say it is great to be back here in front of you, because this is not my first time actually speaking at one of your meetings. It's not my second time either. I think it's my third, right, David? Not counting Freethought. Yeah, we're not counting that. We're only counting actually the regular routine meetings here at the University Club. Yeah, it's good to be back. So you already heard some background. So Senate District 17 is most of Orange County east of I-4. And I want to make sure that you all know that we're a senator for everyone, and we're here to represent and serve everyone regardless of whether you live within the boundaries of Senate District 17 or not. So we encourage you to please reach out when you need constituent services, you need help with anything. We are here to represent you. So I'm actually glad that I'm here today, because I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to attend, because the Florida legislature extended the legislative session beyond the 60 days. And I want to kind of give you a recap of legislative session and everything that we advocated for this year and what's still remaining as far as the work that's needing to be done. So for those who don't know, actually 60 days is the usual length of a legislative session. That's how long we are required to be in Tallahassee to pass bills, to pass a budget. Actually, that's the only thing that we are constitutionally required to do when we're up there, is pass the state budget. And we were not able to pass a state budget, as many of you probably read about in the news. And so I want to talk a little bit about why there's a debate about the budget and what the real hangups are there. But I also want to kind of tell you what we were able to get done. So I'm proud to say that we did pass a bill off the Senate floor this year that also passed off of the House floor. That is one of the 60 bills the governor received on Friday that he has 7 days to take action on. So this is a bill that I introduced with Representative Rita Harris, who's also a friend of the Central Florida Freethought community. And it is about making sure and requiring that school personnel and contract personnel are trained to administer EpiPens in our public schools from K through 8, not only during regular school hours, but they're also now going to be required to be trained to administer those EpiPens for before school, school-sponsored activities, and for after-school, school-sponsored activity in the case that a child has an anaphylactic allergic reaction to a triggering allergen. A lot of kids and a lot of adults actually have anaphylaxis, which can be a life-threatening allergic reaction. And it's really, really important, in order for us to save lives, that school personnel is trained and ready to administer EpiPens in the case that there's an anaphylactic reaction. So we are eagerly anticipating that the governor will sign that bill into law in the next 7 days, and we'll be ready to celebrate that. Thank you, David. As soon as that actually happens. We're also proud to say that one of the bills we co-sponsored, Senate Bill 80, also passed and will be signed by the governor because he has committed to signing it. And that is Senate Bill 80, which protects all of our state parks from being paved over by developers, turned into pickleball courts, turned into hotel resorts and what have you. Do y'all remember last year when there was a big controversy when it was leaked that the state of Florida was actually planning to profiteer off of our state parks? This was something that the DeSantis administration was involved in and supporting behind the scenes. And then when that leaked publicly, of course, there was just bipartisan opposition and outrage to such a plan. And so it's really interesting to see that since then, actually, we've been able to pass this law to prohibit that from ever happening again. And the governor, knowing that he really stepped in it when he got caught with his hand in the cookie jar, agreed to sign it as soon as it's sent to his desk because, of course, right? We were also able to enact some really important condo reforms. Many of you saw that after the Surfside collapse, the Florida legislature passed comprehensive reforms to require that HOAs and particularly condominium buildings had the reserves on hand financially to be able to maintain their properties and be able to fund repairs so that a Surfside type situation would never happen again. But that's had a lot of unintended consequences. And so the bill that we passed this year that also will be signed, or may have been signed already by the governor, which I supported as well, will basically give not only the condo owners, but the HOAs some more financial flexibility to be able to stave off having to impose large assessments on their condo owners. This is something that has impacted a lot of not just low income, but folks who are condo owners who live on a fixed income, they're retired, from having to face like large assessments that have come as a result of that. So that's been very impactful, not only in Central Florida, but also across the state. I also want to tell you about some really bad stuff that we were able to stop. Because I don't know if you noticed by watching the news, Tallahassee is, it's been a very interesting political environment this session. For those who don't know, obviously we have a Republican governor, so they control the executive branch, but they also control the legislature. Republicans hold a supermajority in both the Florida Senate and in the Florida House. But this session was actually defined by infighting from within the majority party, where not only we were not able to pass a budget, but also for once, finally, the Florida legislature, which is Republican supermajority, is beginning to reassert its independence from the governor's office and the executive branch as an independent branch of government. They are finally pushing back. They are in many ways holding the governor accountable for his excesses, and they are beginning to assert our independence as a legislature. Now, what that means, it's kind of a day late and a dollar short. I wish that they would have done so earlier, but the way that that manifested itself is we started seeing lots of reforms coming through both chambers that are meant to kind of rein in the governor's executive authority. We saw lots of higher education reforms, for example, that came through this legislative session. The Florida Senate also has the responsibility of Senate confirmations. It's very similar to what happens at the federal level, where any of the president's appointees have to be confirmed by the U.S. Senate. The same happens in Florida. The Florida Senate has to confirm all of the gubernatorial appointees. And there were many that were either not confirmed or they were just outright rejected by the Florida Senate because of their extremism, particularly in higher education. We basically had Scott Yenor, who was the chair of the Board of Trustees of UWF, that's the University of West Florida, withdrew, he actually resigned from the chairmanship because he knew that he would not get confirmed by the Florida Senate after he made anti-LGBT, anti-Semitic, and anti-women comments that were extremely controversial for a board of trustee chair for a public university. Two of his associates that were on the same board of trustees at UWF also were not confirmed, or they were outright rejected when Republicans joined with Democrats to oppose their confirmation. And the reason that's important in the higher education space is because UWF was becoming the next new college of Florida in our state, meaning it was the next public university that the governor had his sights set on creating a hostile right-wing takeover of that institution, as he did in New College. How many of you heard about what happened at New College in the last couple of years? Almost pretty much all of you. So at New College, one of our 12 public universities in the state, the governor installed all of his own people on the board of trustees that were hard right, extremists. A lot of them were culture warriors, in fact, that didn't even live in the state of Florida, that their agenda was really just to get rid of anything that they considered to be diversity, equity, and inclusion at the university, anything that they considered to be woke. They began abolishing certain degree programs, certain classes that were offered at New College, and UWF was perceived as the next domino that was going to fall in our state university system. So I'm very proud of the fact that the Florida Senate in particular actually stood up this year and said enough and asserted our independence by blocking many of those Senate confirmations that took place. Now, a lot of bad bills died. Every anti-LGBTQ piece of legislation that was introduced this year in Florida was completely stopped and did not move forward, which is a big change, right? That's a big change compared to previous years. Why were they stopped? Well, they were stopped because of public opposition, because advocacy works and advocacy matters. And the public opposition to this anti-LGBTQ agenda has been sustained. It's not just one that's been, oh, this year we opposed them, therefore they didn't pass. I mean, we opposed them in all the previous years as well, and there was public opposition then. But the difference now is that what's been guaranteed is that any time one of these bills is put on the agenda in Tallahassee for a hearing, just dozens and sometimes even hundreds of people were showing up in the state capitol to register their public comment and their public opposition, to the point that it was actually gumming up the works in the legislative process, and it was slowing things down to the extent that they knew every time they put something on the agenda that was controversial like this, it was going to be dragged out, and it was going to be a very long, painful process, as it should be, to get it passed. And so they realized that they perhaps maybe didn't have the appetite for that this year. And for once, legislators actually practiced some kind of restraint in prioritizing those types of issues. So I'm really glad that that happened. How many of you know what tourist development taxes are, or TDT as we know it? Okay, so we've got a good number of you are aware of what that is. The reason I bring that up is because actually I've been very involved. In fact, I've been leading the charge in the Florida Senate to reform how we spend tourist development taxes or hotel taxes in the state of Florida. Why? Well, because here in Central Florida, as you know, we are the #1 tourist destination, not only in the state, but also in the country. And we welcome that. But what also happens when we get increased tourism activity is we have higher costs and we have more people who are committing crimes. We have more of a need for public transit. It puts more of a stress on not only our public transportation infrastructure, but also on our water infrastructure as well. There's more of a need for workforce housing and affordable housing. I mean, these are a strain on our public resources. And so what tourist development taxes are is it's a 6.5% tax that people pay when they stay overnight at either a hotel or a short-term rental like an Airbnb. So mostly tourists are paying the tourist development taxes. However, the laws around hotel taxes are so strict around what you are allowed and what you are not allowed to spend TDT revenue and tax collections on that we are currently spending $0.0 of tourist development taxes on public transit and public transportation. Why are we not spending any of this tourist-related tax on transit, which is obviously going to bolster and help grow our tourism economy? Well, it's because right now the law says that in order for us to be allowed to spend tourist development taxes on public transit, we must first spend 40% of everything we take in on tourist development taxes on tourism advertising, also known as Visit Orlando, also known as corporate ads promoting the idea that people should come visit here. 40% of Orange County's tourist development taxes, just to give you an idea of how much money we're talking about, 40% of our collections annually would represent approximately $140 million in public money every single year. We don't even give them that. Orange County currently gives Visit Orlando about 31% of our public dollars collected through the tourist development tax. That's $100 million in public money, taxpayer money is spent annually to fund corporate ads at Visit Orlando. You heard me correctly, $100 million of public money for corporate ads at Visit Orlando every year. I believe that is excessive. I think that is an excessive amount of public money, taxpayer money to be spent when we have a housing affordability crisis, when we have a homelessness crisis in Central Florida, when we don't have enough workforce housing, when we are desperately looking for funds to connect the Sunrail train to the Orlando airport or expand services, when our public schools are underfunded. I think it's inappropriate for us to spend $100 million on corporate ads a year from taxpayers. So I brought forward reforms that would limit excessive public spending via Visit Orlando, via corporate ads, and would allow Orange County finally the flexibility to spend hotel taxes on public transit. And I'm proud to announce my proposal is in the Senate tax package that is still up for consideration when we return to Tallahassee to actually pass a budget. So, thank you. So, just to be clear, if our proposal passes when we return to pass the budget, it means that effective immediately, Orange County government would be allowed to begin spending our TDT tax dollars on public transit. They could use our hotel taxes to expand Sunrail service to nights and weekends. They could use tourist development taxes to partially fund the Sunrail connection to the Orlando airport, which we know is desperately needed, not only to bolster tourism, but also to help our residents, to help our tourism workers who need to get to and from work. And of course, it wouldn't end at the Orlando airport. I'm sure many of you are familiar with what we talk about as the Sunshine Corridor, which is the future, the visionary project for public transit in Central Florida that will eventually connect the Sunrail train to the Orlando airport, which we need to fund. And that would feed into the existing Brightline network that would then go out to the tourism corridor, the theme parks, if you will, and extend all the way to Tampa to connect our regions and actually grow our economy. This is it's visionary, but we have to secure the funds to pay for it. And I believe that supplementing those projects with tourist development tax dollars is something that we have to do. Now, the budget. So I want to leave lots of time for questions because I've already talked a lot and I can already picture in my head, there's a checklist of things I wanted to talk to you about that I've not even mentioned. So right now, the reason we don't have a budget is because the Florida Senate and the Florida House cannot agree. Now, most of you hear about what's known as a government shutdown, usually from Congress, from DC. We hear about government shutdowns like almost all the time now in modern day politics. And the recipe for a government shutdown is usually a person who is in the White House is from a different party than the party that controls Congress. There's divided power in Washington where Republicans and Democrats, are kind of sharing power. They're at odds with each other. They can't agree. And so it kind of creates a scenario for a government shutdown. That is not the case in the state of Florida because, as you know, the governor is a Republican and Republicans hold a supermajority in both the Florida House and Senate. There is no divided power. They control everything. And yet, if we do not pass a state budget before July 1st, we will have an unprecedented state government shutdown in the state of Florida. We still have no idea what this budget is going to look like, and we are now fast approaching June 1st. I don't know when I'm going back to Tallahassee to pass this budget because the budget negotiations have broken down to the point where they're just not seeing eye to eye, and there's a $4.5 billion difference between the state Senate budget and the Florida House budget. What's the disagreement? The disagreement is mostly about whether or not to include tax relief for Florida residents, and also what that tax relief should include. There are opposing views on whether or not it should be solely reliant on property tax relief, which is an idea that's being pushed by the governor, or whether it should be sales tax relief. Now, let me kind of give you a baseline on what Florida's tax code looks like, just to paint the bigger picture. So we know that property taxes fund what? What do they fund? They fund, right? They fund our public schools. Our property taxes also fund roads. They fund police. They fund fire. I mean, that is the primary revenue source that local government, our cities and counties, have to actually fund really mostly schools, police, and fire, and to an extent roads as well. So the governor has proposed, if you can believe it, eliminating property taxes. So yes, the governor is proposing to defund the police, just so that we are aware, because I mean, it's hard to make this stuff up. If you eliminate property taxes, you have to find another funding source to fund all of these critical government services. So most reports have basically estimated that if Florida eliminated property taxes, we would likely have to, at minimum, double the sales tax in the state of Florida into the double digits. I mean, we're talking about 12, 13, 14, 15% sales tax on every item to make up for the fact that we're losing $53 billion, I think usually is the revenue generated from annual property taxes. You have to make that up somewhere.
But would that be enough?
Would it be enough? That's it. That's actually a great question. We don't know because we're all scrambling to respond to this crazy idea from the governor to eliminate property taxes under the gun because there's a time crunch to pass a budget. And, these things need to be researched. They need to be thought out. We need answers to these very good questions. So the Republican Speaker of the House, as an alternative to kind of take the pressure off of eliminating property taxes, introduced a different idea, which was we should lower the sales tax instead. Now, here's what I will say. Sales taxes are extremely regressive tax policy. Florida, actually, many organizations have identified and tagged Florida as having the most regressive tax code in the nation. What does that mean? It means that the people who can afford to pay taxes the least actually pay the most and have the most burden to pay taxes. Why? Well, because if sales tax is a percentage of the sale, then if you're low income or you're, a poor working family, then the sales tax that you're paying on a loaf of bread and on basic necessities represents a substantially higher percentage of your income than a higher income person. So the most burden is on those who can afford it the least. So reducing the level of how regressive our tax system I see as a good thing in concept. However, this is the big caveat I come with as a progressive Democrat, if you will, who cares about not having a regressive tax code and having a more fair tax code. Any tax relief that is proposed has to be at minimum revenue neutral, meaning if we are reducing revenue with any type of tax relief, that has to be offset with new revenue somewhere else. Does that mean new taxes? No, not necessarily. One idea that many of us have been pushing for many years is an idea known as combined reporting. Combined reporting is making sure that large multinational corporations, let's say like Disney, or any of the other large giant corporations you can think of, Amazon, the list goes on and on and on. If they are Florida based because they're trying to shield their assets from taxation, that they would be required to actually pay the taxes they owe on all of their companies and subsidiaries. The way that corporations usually avoid taxation and they they find a way to alleviate their obligation to pay what they owe, is they will break up their companies into a number of smaller companies that do not meet the minimum required revenue to begin paying corporate income taxes. So corporate income taxes you only pay if you bring in above a certain amount of revenue. So corporations consistently do this in Florida, where they're just like, okay, well, let's just create a bunch of smaller companies and make sure that they are just barely not high enough in revenue to be eligible to have to pay corporate income taxes, and then we won't have to pay on anything. So combined reporting actually requires that they report all of their subsidiaries as one, so that there is a very clear picture of what their revenue and income is, so that they can pay the appropriate corporate income tax. This is not increasing taxes on corporations, it's making sure they pay what they owe. That would generate, by the way, a lot of people predict approximately $2.5 billion in annual revenue to the state of Florida. That would be new revenue that we are not collecting right now. So as a Democrat, as a progressive, I think corporations need to pay their fair share. And if we are going to make sure that we give tax relief to the working class, to people who are struggling, to people who need relief, we need to do it in a way that is fair and that does not result in the unintended consequence of major cuts to critical government services. I have not even mentioned anything about Hope, Florida. I have not mentioned anything about Hope, Florida. Before I even say okay, all right, let me just say it. So let me just give you an overview of that, and then we'll take questions if that's okay, David. Because I know someone's going to ask you about Hope, Florida. So how many of you have heard about the Hope, Florida Foundation scandal? Okay, like nearly everyone in the room. So let me give you a breakdown of how this happened, because the Florida House of Representatives has launched an investigation into the Hope, Florida scandal. We have a Medicaid provider in Florida whose name is Centene. They provide Medicaid services to low-income families who are eligible for those services. It was discovered recently, years ago, that Centene, our Medicaid contractor, was actually overcharging the state of Florida for Medicaid services. They overbilled us. So the state of Florida brought forward a lawsuit to try to claw back those funds. You know, we were overcharged as a state. You owe us this money back. A settlement was reached in that lawsuit by the state of Florida with Centene that they would pay us back the large amounts of money that they overcharged us. And as part of that settlement agreement, the state of Florida secretly and without notifying the state legislature said, would you please divert $10 million of those public funds that you owe the state of Florida to the Hope Florida Foundation, which is currently run by the First Lady, Casey DeSantis? Just give that foundation $10 million, please, as part of that settlement. They did so without the approval of the Florida legislature, without notification to the Florida legislature. And the state of Florida diverted $10 million of our public Medicaid dollars to her charity in violation of both state and federal laws. So state law says if the state of Florida, if the taxpayers win in a settlement from a lawsuit, there's only two places that money can go. It either goes to the state general revenue, which is basically the state's like regular bank account, or it can go into a trust fund that is specifically created to receive settlement dollars from litigation. The Hope Florida Foundation is neither one of these two things. So if that part doesn't outrage you enough, let me tell you about what happened after Hope Florida received the $10 million of our public Medicaid money. They almost immediately dispersed the $10 million into two $5 million grants to dark money groups, who then immediately laundered and dispersed that money to a political action committee that was run by the governor's then chief of staff to oppose Amendment 3 to legalize cannabis in the state of Florida in 2024. For political advertisements, a lot of that money also was dispersed to the Republican Party of Florida to do the same. So that's money laundering. It's illegal money laundering that someone should go to prison for. And to add insult to injury, I say that those political action committees that received this laundered money after they worked their way through this money laundering scheme, they were operated by the governor's then chief of staff. His name is James Uthmeyer. Well, he's not the governor's chief of staff anymore, the person who ran this political action committee that received those funds. James Uthmeyer is the state of Florida's attorney general now. When Ashley Moody resigned as our publicly elected state attorney general so that she could be appointed to the U.S. Senate by Governor DeSantis to replace Senator Marco Rubio, who vacated the position to be part of the Trump administration, Governor DeSantis appointed to replace then Attorney General Ashley Moody. He appointed his former chief of staff, James Uthmeyer, to be our new attorney general. It appears James Uthmeyer orchestrated this illegal money laundering scheme. And yes, he is the state's top law enforcement official. So yeah, all of this is a very big problem, and it's a very big scandal. The reason the Florida House of Representatives paused their investigation of the Hope Florida Foundation, to their credit, because there's a super Republican majority in the Florida House that has been leading this investigation. The reason they stopped the investigation is because witnesses stopped coming forward. They were asked to come in to testify in front of these Florida House committees, and they just stopped showing up to cover their ass, pretty much. And so they had to stop the investigation. But this is not over. In fact, I would like to believe that soon, hopefully, federal prosecutors will begin to get involved in making sure that people are held accountable for this illegal money laundering scheme. because, you know, the real victim here is not only the taxpayers who has $10 million taken from them and stolen from them in this money laundering scheme. It's also Medicaid recipients, people with disabilities who desperately need that money to fund critical government services. I'll give you an example. I budget Medicaid waiver services in the state of Florida, which basically funds services to give people with disabilities the ability to live and work in their communities. The I budget Medicaid waiver Florida in our state is currently 22,000 people long. There's 22,000 people with disabilities in our state who are not receiving the services that they are eligible for because we don't have enough money in Medicaid. Some people actually, the most recent stat says that approximately 40% of the 22,000 people on waiting lists for iBudget Medicaid waiver services have been on the waiting list for more than 10 years. And many have died while on the waiting list, waiting for services that they never received. So they are the real victims in this money laundering scheme, and I hope someone goes to prison.
The first question is insurance, house insurance, the rates. Why wasn't that discussed at all on this year's session? Second is Democratic Party in Florida is dead. This is what the Florida Roundup is saying they're irrelevant, they're just spectators right now to see what's happening with the Republicans. And the problem with the House and the Senate right now with the budget is they are trying to position themselves to run for governor, maybe Perez or whoever else. So I wanted to first talk about the insurance issue, but also what do you think about the Democratic Party Florida being dead, irrelevant, and just a spectator?
Thank you for that question, Nicholas. First, let's talk about property insurance. So property insurance should be top of mind for everyone. It's been top of mind for me for a long time. I'm a homeowner as well. Floridians now basically pay the highest property insurance rates compared to any other state in the country. This is a complicated issue. However, these are the values that drive me, and these are the things that I would want to see in a property reform proposal that still have not been vetted or heard in the Florida legislature that we need. We need property insurance reforms that first continue to give homeowners the right to sue when they are denied legitimate claims from their property insurance provider. Second, that cap increases on property insurance rates in a way that prevent property insurance increases from being so severe within one particular year. We have to find a way to actually cap those increases to keep these costs down. Third, I would like to see citizens insurance actually be repurposed, not as the insurer of last resort, but to be one that can instead be a provider of universal wind coverage. This is something that I want you to think about. What if Citizens Insurance offered you wind coverage for your property, for your residential property? No matter who you are, no matter what your income is, no matter how old your roof is, that they would be required to provide you universal wind coverage at a modest premium, and they would not be able to reject you. The state of Texas, which is not a blue state or a liberal state by any means, did this 20 years ago, where they created a government-backed universal provider of wind coverage, and it has helped bring down property insurance rates. So the reason none of these reforms were considered in this legislative session is because I think the supermajority does not have solutions. And I don't want to oversimplify anything, but the reason in the last few years, all you heard from Tallahassee was, don't say gay or trans, 6-week abortion bans, tax on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and censorship, and blah, blah, blah. all of these really terrible ideas unrelated to property insurance that are extremely divisive, that people have very strong opinions about on both sides, is because they intentionally created a diversion away from the fact that they have no solutions to reducing property insurance rates in the state of Florida. Is the Democratic Party in Florida dead? As my former Senate Democratic leader, Jason Pizzo, said on his way out, when he left the Democratic Party, when he made an announcement on the Senate floor to become a no-party affiliated elected official. No, it's not dead. We're struggling and we're not in great shape, but we're not dead. And the examples that I would put in front of you to demonstrate that we're not dead is the fact that in the most recent 2 special elections in solidly ruby red areas of Florida, like the Panhandle and like Brevard County, you saw as much as a 15% swing in our direction. Did we? Well, we did. We had no chance of winning, by the way. We had no chance of winning those seats. But what we can see there is we see certainly a lot of dissatisfaction with the Trump administration's first 100 days that have been focused on reckless and irresponsible Doge-style cuts across the board that have not only eliminated tens of thousands of jobs across the country, have eliminated billions of dollars in federal grants that actually grow our economy and create those jobs, but were also Doge cuts that were only intended not to make the government more efficient, but to be able to fund more tax cuts for millionaires and billionaires like Elon Musk. There's a lot of dissatisfaction there, and I think it's going to create a good opportunity for us in Florida with the right candidate and candidates to finally begin to move the pendulum in a new direction.
So along those lines, we know that Trump cannot close a government agency. However, he can completely gut it, as we have seen with a bunch that is going on. And we're currently looking at FEMA being potentially gutted as well. And obviously, given that we are a hurricane capital, climate change, hurricanes increasing in severity and frequency, has that conversation happened at all at the state level? Like, what are we doing about that? And how does it go hand in hand with our insurance issues?
Thank you for that very good question. So the question was posed recently in the state, how would Florida do if FEMA was eliminated? I think I will recap the governor's response by saying, no worries, we can handle it. Florida's great.
No property.
Yeah, that's obviously not realistic and not true. We definitely need FEMA. I mean, FEMA can always do a better job at making sure people get paid quickly. They can always do a better job of making sure that they're on the ground more rapidly to be able to offer those resources after a hurricane. But we desperately need FEMA. We desperately need those resources. And Florida cannot handle the response of natural disasters like hurricanes completely on our own. I mean, that's just not realistic. So we need to resist any effort to eliminate FEMA at the federal level, because the state is just not in the position to be able to completely handle 100% of the government response in response to natural disasters. I hope that answers your question.
First of all, thank you very much for being here. Can you take a minute and just talk a little bit about Florida Doge and what the governor's end game appears to be with that? And is there legislative oversight of Florida Doge, and what you're seeing from your perspective of that?
Thank you for that question. So what I find interesting about Florida Doge, like, we have to go in and we have to find all of the waste and the government efficiency, government, waste. We have to rein this in. I just want to remind everyone that Republicans have controlled every lever of state government in Florida for over 30 years. So if it's so terribly inefficient that we need a Florida Doge, What have they been doing for the last 30 years that they have been completely in control of all of this? Most of the Florida Doge stuff has been focused on higher education. It's been focused on our state universities because that is the target du jour, so to speak. They want to accuse higher education, our state universities, of just being loaded with waste, fraud, and abuse. I can tell you that it's already resulting not only because of what is being proposed, but also because of the cuts at the federal level. A lot of these grants are being canceled. Federal grants play a substantial role in research at our state universities, a substantial role. We have lost I think already we've lost close to $3 billion in research grants in Florida because of the federal Doge cuts, and those disproportionately impact, of course, funding at higher education. So we have to, this is why it was also so important for the Florida Senate to assert its independence and to deny confirmation to some of these board of trustees appointees to the state universities, because right now there is no Florida Doge bill, nothing passed. This is just hot air coming from the governor right now, and it has not manifested itself into any bill that's actually been passed yet. But stay tuned, because we're going to be watching that. You know, to answer your question, it's mostly focused on higher education, and most of the impacts have come from the federal Doge.
Okay, 2 questions. Was there one here, or Lisa, and then you?
Hi, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
First comment is, do you think it's easier for Democrats now in the House and Senate because DeSantis is termed out and they no longer have to cater to his whims? Second question is, is it possible, it's Pam Bondi, that she would not want to investigate the obvious fraud of the money laundering in Florida? How could she counter that? And third is, can you go into a little bit more description, because I'm on the board of my HOA, as far as what you think is going to be passed and the assistance for the condo owners, because you mentioned that.
Sure. Thank you for those great questions. Let me start actually with the last one, with the condo reforms. So you know that there's a reserve requirement for HOAs and condos that was imposed by the new laws after Surfside. They said by a certain date, you're going to have X amount of funding in reserves to be able to do this type of maintenance to your condo as a result of this law. What the reforms are to ease those obligations is, one, they postponed by a full calendar year what the date was that was the deadline to have the reserves in place. 2, they redefined or clarified who was included to say that it was for condominium buildings that were at least 3 stories. So it has to be 3 stories or higher. And third, and this is one of the more important things, they said lines of credit issued to the HOA in order to meet the reserves would be eligible to count towards reserves. So rather than imposing an assessment on all of the condo owners to say, we need this cash, we need this money to have the reserve on hand, the new law, the new reform that just passed said, well, you could do assessments, but you could also just obtain a line of credit in lieu of cash assessments to meet that threshold. And obviously a line of credit is a line of credit, it's not cash. So that is the core of what the reforms are for the HOAs and the condos. I hope that's helpful. What were the other 2 questions to get?
The fraud, waste, and abuse of DeSantis and his support.
Yes, and then also you mentioned Pam Bondi. You know, what is she so inclined to launch a DOJ investigation? weird things are happening in politics. Look, so much of the feud, I'm sorry if this sounds like palace intrigue, like political palace intrigue, but it's helpful as far as informing why these conflicts are happening between Republicans in Florida. So much of it has to do with political ambition, but it also has a lot to do with the still existing feud between Governor DeSantis and the Trump administration, right? You know, there's still a lot of bad blood between President Trump and Governor DeSantis because of, you know, Governor DeSantis running against Trump in a Republican primary for president. And that is manifesting itself in a lot of different ways. He is a lame duck governor. He will not be our governor in 2026 November. Thank God. He's term limited. But, you know, there's all this coverage of, oh, maybe Casey DeSantis is going to run for governor, and Byron Donalds is running for governor as a Republican. And, you know, there's all these names that are out there. And a lot of these conflicts between Republicans, it's like a proxy war, if you will, between Trump and DeSantis, because even though DeSantis is a lame duck, you know, they're suggesting that Casey DeSantis is going to run for governor. Maybe she'll be the governor. And then that will be a continuation of that feud. So actually, Democrats, like myself, have leveraged this conflict to give us more power and influence in the process. It has meant that policy fights and fights around bills and legislation on the floor have actually sometimes outright failed in the Florida Senate or have been extremely close. I'll give you a few examples. I mean, I've never seen this because the Republicans have such a supermajority in the Florida Senate. Like, votes on the Senate floor, they're not close. They're not close, right? We have 10 Democrats out of 40 senators, right? So they're not supposed to be close. There was a bunch of stuff that was really close and a bunch of stuff that just died on the Senate floor as a result of this, which I was shocked to see it. First example, there was a really bad bill, a pro-developer bill that sought to overturn the rural boundary protections that Orange and Seminole County voters approved in the last election cycle to protect rural and environmentally sensitive lands. The bill would have overturned all of that. The bill failed on the Senate floor on a vote of 19 nays, 18 yays. There was one vote difference. And it was so weird. Do you know who led the charge against that bill and were successful in defeating it on the Senate floor? Former Republican Party of Florida Chair and State Senator Blaise Ngolia, Republican State Senator Jay Collins, both of them are hard right, like Super MAGA, and State Senator Carlos Guillermo Smith. Those two. We led the charge against it, and that was like a weird political coalition. Right? Like, I even went to Senator Collins after. I'm like, hey, I really like when we work together to defeat bad legislation like this. And it was just really interesting. There was another bill that just like outright failed on the Senate floor. And it was a public records bill that said that if a police officer was involved in a use of force against a citizen or a resident, the bill said that their name would be not available for public record, and that the police agency would not have to release the name of the officer involved in like an officer involved shooting, that they could hold on to their name indefinitely and that the public would know what the name of the police officer was. And public records exemptions actually require a 2/3 majority in the Florida Senate. And when it came down to the vote, the bill got 23 yays and the rest nays. And that was a failed vote because they needed 25 votes for it to pass, because it required a 2/3 majority to pass the Florida Senate. So I hope that answers your question as far as like what happens, like if they're infighting, does that give Democrats more power? Yes. Yes, it gives us more power. And I don't know if I'm the only one that feels this way, but while we're in this budget impasse, there is a very easy way that we can solve all of this and get a budget. If the Senate President and the Speaker of the House would put together a budget that gets the support of Democrats like me, and we vote yes on it, we could very easily get the 2/3 majority that's needed to shut the governor down and to override a veto, so that when he vetoes the budget that we send him, we can say, that's nice, next, veto override, and we're just done with him. We've already overridden the governor's authority with two budget overrides that we did at the very beginning of session, which were retroactive to last year's budget. The legislature overrode the governor's veto on a couple of line items from last year's budget, and they did so at the very beginning of the special session on immigration, because they were kind of already in a fight with him over immigration related issues. And they're like, okay, since we're already fighting and he's already mad at us, let's just override his vetoes from last year right now so that we can just rip off the Band-Aid and get it over with. And I loved it. They were like all in favor. I was like, yes, absolutely. Override the governor. Get rid of that veto. Like, this is the legislature asserting its independence. Finally.
That's amazing.
So thank you again for being here and thank you for your candor.
Absolutely.
Could you cover, you started to touch on it, but could you cover a little bit more about the basics of legislature? How many senators and how many representatives we have, what the terms are, what you typically do when you're not in session,
Thank you for that.
and also where we stand with the change to make it harder for the citizen initiatives.
Good question.
Yes, and thank you for bringing up the citizen-led amendment bill, because that was one of the things that I had on my list, and I'm like, I didn't even get to that. So first, just the basic makeup of the Florida legislature. There's 40 state senators. There's 120 state representatives in the Florida House. 160 of us total. In the Florida Senate, we soon will have 11 Democrats out of 40. So again, we are in the super minority. I am one of the 10 currently. I say we will soon have 11 because a special election will be held both in June for the primary and September for the general, to replace the late Senator Geraldine Thompson, who unexpectedly passed away earlier this year. And she was a tried and true Democrat and a legend and an inspiration. I just want to say that. And so whoever is elected to that Senate seat, is a solidly blue seat, will be the 11th Democrat. In the House, I feel like I don't have the numbers right. I think we have like 32 or 33 Democrats out of 120 in the Florida House of Representatives. So yeah, we're in the super minority. What do we do during the year when we're not in session? Well, that's why I gave you like my little pamphlet, my little flyer that just says, if you need help with any of these things, anything related to state agencies, government support, government services from one of our state agencies, please reach out. Constituent services is our #1 priority when we're out of session, as it is when we're in session. But after the 60-day session, yeah, I mean, they consider our legislature in Florida to be a part-time legislature, but it's full-time work, because when we're not in session, good representatives and good senators are still out in the community. They're engaged in constituent services year-round. They're present in their districts, and that's a full-time job, in my opinion, even though it's part-time pay. And by the way, yeah, as a lawmaker, I get paid $28,000 a year as my salary for this full-time job that is considered a part-time position. The citizen-led amendment process. This is the worst bill to pass this year. So basically, the bill that was immediately signed by the governor after the legislature passed it, makes it nearly impossible for another citizen-led amendment to make it on the ballot to change the Constitution ever again, because they just pulled out all the stops in making the process to collect petitions to get a question on the ballot, a constitutional amendment on the ballot, so onerous that no one will ever be able to do it. I mean, they did absurd things like say that volunteers would be guilty of third-degree felonies if you had more than 25 signed petitions on your person and were not registered as a volunteer with the state of Florida. If you have a petition that you want to, ask your friends to sign to get something on the ballot and you're not paid by anyone, you're used to bringing your clipboard to a meeting like this and saying, hey, sign the petition, sign the petition. I'll take it from you and I'll bring it and I'll mail it to the supervisor of elections. I got you. If you don't register with the state to tell them that you're a volunteer, although you've never had to register before, and you have more than 25 signed petitions in your possession, you're guilty of a third-degree felony, which carries a 5-year prison sentence, up to 5 years, and you lose your voting rights as a felon. That's just an example of one of the many onerous provisions in that law that are intended to make it impossible. Like they shorten the time frame that you have to send the signed petition back to the supervisor of elect. They claim fraud. Oh, there's fraud going on when people tried to get Amendment 4 on the ballot to overturn the 6-week abortion ban. It wasn't fraud. There were errors on errors happen all the time. You get a wrong address or a not clearly written name that's not updated compared to the supervisor of election. They're in another county versus the county they thought they were registered to vote in. These are errors in the process. And when you shorten the time frame that is required to get those petitions back, you also can't check your work. You also can't reduce the number of errors that you have by checking all the petitions that you have here. I digress. The day after the bill was signed into law by the governor, immediately the group that is currently collecting petitions for a constitutional amendment to expand Medicaid in the state of Florida sued the state and is bringing a lawsuit forward that now the medical marijuana provider Trulieve has joined in that litigation against the state of Florida to try to overturn what we believe is an unconstitutional law. So thank you for that question.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Carlos.
Thank you all. This is great. This is great. Thank you for inviting me, David, and disappointed first, no privilege. I love being here with the Central Florida Freethought community as often as I can be. When I was a candidate and I was running, I was endorsed actually by the Freedom from Religion organization, and I was very proud of that endorsement. I currently identify as agnostic, although I was raised Catholic and I'm a recovering former Catholic. But
people like you.
That's right. And, I also believe, as you do, that, there is a clear separation between church and state. There's so much praying that happens in government spaces as well. And while we don't think that that's appropriate, it ain't changing. And so we also work to try to bring in other faiths and other spiritualities to be represented. I was proud when I was in the Florida House that we invited humanist chaplain T. Rogers to actually do the invocation on the floor of the House of Representatives. It was wonderful. I would love the opportunity to do that also in the Florida Senate someday. But thank you all for having me. It's been great. And follow me at Carlos G. Smith on all of the various social media.
Freedom from religion.